as activists to continue doing the work that we are doing. Many times we come to these spaces and it feels like a reunion, because many of us have occupied these spaces since the beginning of time. Me too, I continue to drive that anger, whatever position I'm in, and I'm certainly bringing that anger with me within the South African Commission for Gender Equality. You know, these days I can't just say what I want to say. When you're a political appointee, you must always look around the room to see if there are journalists. So, with that said, I will really go along to the speech that I've drafted and the speech that was okayed on my behalf. So, before I go off on a tangent, just a very short introduction. I am Commissioner Leanne van der Merwe. I've recently joined the South African Commission for Gender Equality. I'm also, outside of my role, the founder and the director of SHE in the Eastern Cape, and I'm a board member of the National Sex Worker Movement, Sisonke, within South Africa, and 100 other things that you can find on Google. And so, the Commission for Gender Equality has been established in terms of Section 187 of the Constitution of the Republic of South Africa, and this commission has been set up to promote respect for gender equality and the protection, development, and attainment of gender equality. It sounds flowery, huh? The CGE will advance, promote, and protect gender equality in South Africa through undertaking research, public education, policy development, legislative initiatives, effective monitoring, and litigation. I am sorry that I couldn't be here for the entire conference. I shift around a few things and I'm happy to be able to speak this afternoon. But this morning I went around the different sessions that were conducted, and I was so richly surprised about the vibrant energy in the conference, despite what we are going through. Uganda is a crisis, so is Tanzania, and we just heard the same from Burundi. And so the political moment within which we finding ourselves is very confusing, because on the one hand, we have seen some African states beginning to decriminalize same-sex relationships, in particular Lesotho, Mozambique, the Republic of the Seychelles, Botswana, and Angola in recent years. Uganda, on the other hand, has just resuscitated the David Bahati bill. And this bill is a historical terror, if I can put it that way, because I remember in 2014, when this law was declared unconstitutional, we were in a conference room in Tanzania, just celebrating, holding each other, and being grateful for being in that moment. Sadly, that is now resuscitated. Whether or not the Ugandan president will sign the bill, the important thing to remember is its effect on homophobia at a societal level, because we cannot legislate for hearts and minds, as we have seen so clearly from Camp Kakuma. In the same vein, South Africa has been having this long drawn-out conversation on the decriminalization of sex work. Again, even if sex work gets decriminalized, there's still a deep level of work that we have to do, because we cannot legislate the stigma away. Never mind the fact that sex work is still criminalized in most African countries. Destigmatizing queerness, transness, and sex work requires a work of the heart and mind. I want to reflect very quickly on South Africa's role as a beacon for queer and trans rights on the continent. The South African government response to queer and trans refugees and asylum seekers leave much to be desired. A few weeks ago, I was also asked to speak at a conference on the human rights of trans asylum seekers in South Africa, in Cape Town, and we heard very horrendous things. Things that I, as a South African, are very ashamed about. Because one of the biggest challenges for trans refugees in South Africa remain granting refugees and asylum seekers legal gender recognition. The expectation is for the refugee to return to their country and seek a gender marker change from their very oppressor. How do we begin to make sense of the notion of seeking legal gender recognition from a country and a system from which you fled in the first place? The second biggest challenge for refugees is the provision of gender-affirming care. How do you provide gender-affirming care to folks who essentially do not have a national identity? Somebody who does not have an ID document in order to claim their inherent health rights. How do we provide folks with safety and security? How do we ensure that we create an enabling environment for refugees and asylum seekers in South Africa? We echo a resounding fatigue on the discourse of countries claiming their sovereignty. Those of us who have engaged in the CSW space know that it's been many years that we've tried to negotiate getting language into the document at CSW around queer and trans rights. And the continuous response that we're getting year after year is that each country is a sovereign state and the United Nations cannot dictate to a country about which provisions and which language they are allowing as priorities for human rights. Away from legislative developments, the rampant transphobia aimed at trans women from trans-exclusionary radical feminists is deeply concerning. The utterings made by Chimamanda and Nsiki Mazwai more recently in South Africa is worrying me. It demonstrates how this hateful ideology is starting to move out of the West and the North, and we're starting to see remnants of it on the African continent. And let us please be very mindful that these utterings are not just comments from the peanut gallery. These utterings have real-life implications, especially in relation to safety, its potential to incite violence, policy, access to services, and broader socio-economic, cultural, and political context. In the same tone, I want to talk a little bit about how the movement and queer and trans people on the African continent continue to be ravaged by HIV. We have not started seeing a decline in the HIV prevalence. In fact, we are starting to see the epidemic growing. To give you an idea, in 2017, Potit et al. Had documented HIV prevalence among trans women in Burkina Faso at 3%, Cote d'Ivoire 26%, the Gambia 50%, Lesotho 59%, Malawi 16%, Senegal 39%, Swaziland 14%, and Togo 18%. To contextualize this data, it's important to note that within the general epidemic of these countries, we see a prevalence of between 3 and 14% on average. And this just really emphasizes the unmet needs, healthcare needs of trans people and the broader community of living with HIV. We've also recently published our data in South Africa in the Lancet HIV, in which we have demonstrated a 52% average of HIV prevalence among South African transgender women. I think you would agree with me that these figures are very concerning. It's quite alarming. And despite these alarming rates among transgender women in South Africa, our programmatic data shows that trans women are not engaged in healthcare. Further to that, we've also come to know that delayed HIV testing among trans women is why we often only intervene in the acute stage of disease within this population. Having little understanding of HIV in the trans community, anecdotal evidence have also shown us that there's a growing tuberculosis burden in the trans community. And then finally, women who have sex with women and trans men continue to be invisibilized within the HIV response. We know and understand our communities best. So why is it that in 2023, the HIV response among key population are led by American public health institutions? I won't mention any names, but we all know who we are talking about, because when I got to the conference, I already heard the buzz around this particular topic. The epidemiology sketched here this evening is nothing new to the communities. We know what we have to do as a communities. We know what we need to do in order to realize a more enabling environment for the communities, and yet we've relinquished our right and our responsibility to drive the HIV response within our countries. And this brings me to my next point on the donor agenda. The decolonization of donor agendas is a very old and tired conversation. We've had these conversations ample times in Naivasha. Those of you who are CFCS ancestors will know exactly what I'm talking about. We've made that trip between Nairobi and Naivasha so many times, it feels like I've traveled to the moon. So then, the way in which we think about our relationship with funders, I feel, is deeply problematic. Just to sketch what happens in the donor space is that you submit your proposal, it gets reviewed, if you're lucky you get funding after some hectic due diligence process. In all this time, the funder will request this and that and the other from you, and you'll have many Zoom calls, you will have a lot of negotiations in order to negotiate budget line items. In all of this, one must recognize that the flow of accountability is normally only in one direction, from the grantee to the donor, and never from the donor to the grantee. So donors normally also expect of us to account for every single penny. But how is it that we fit into, when we take those pennies, do we have an awareness of where we fit into the donor strategic areas? Do we know how we fit into our funders' M&E frameworks? Once we submit our intellectual property to donors, do we know how that information gets processed? How that is stored securely? We've had incidents on the African continent where I write a proposal, I submit my proposal, the funder comes back and says, regretfully, we can't find this. And you'll find your concept being implemented in the village right next to yours. We've seen that 100 times. So, within the context of all of that, why is it that the accountability is still flowing only in one direction? Why is it that donors are not held accountable for being negligent with our funding concepts and our intellectual property? This work requires of us to renegotiate a more level playing field. And so given the role of colonialism This may be impossible to achieve, but we can when you come close to my heart. Just on a note of love, I want to talk about the strength of regional advocacy and maintaining the spirit of togetherness. When we talk about accountability, it's not my place to wonder why is it that Cleo gets invited to the CSW in New York every single year. Instead, I need to hold Cleo to account to say, how have you represented my issues? What are you taking away from the discourse? What are you bringing back to the continent? Since we've seen you take selfies in the snow in New York, you had nice beer, we followed you on social media. Now, what is it that you are bringing back to us? How is that shifting our work forward? Most of our work is far too predicated on whether or not we have funding. And we legitimize our work by whether we have funding or not. And the colonizers thrive on these agendas. That in Africa, funding creates division. That is one way in which the West continues to have the upper hand, even within African spaces like this. Each one of us must walk away from this conference with very deep reflections. And some of my reflections include, where has our work gone? What happened to the agenda on queer and trans rights on the African continent? There was a time when gay men referred to CAL as the Coalition of Angry Lesbians. It was a joke, it was the conference joke once that, you know, we have to engage with the angry lesbians and not the African lesbians. Where did those structures go? Do you know whose shoulders you are standing on as an activist? There are many activists who are not in the space anymore. Myself, I'm halfway out, I'm halfway in some days. So now I ask you, whatever happened to those structures? Where's T from Kenya? Where's Outright Namibia? Where's Gerald and Tinky and Mac and Victor Mukasa, Teboho, Tatenda? Where are those folks? And I'm not mentioning these folks because I'm placing them on a pedestal, but I want to give full recognition that people come and go within organizations as activists. Times keep changing, but to the new generation here today, I want to ask, do you know what Themba Nkosi and Skipper Mugabe has gone through to create room for the space that you are currently occupying? I know many of my generation of activist people are told, you are ancestors. You think in a particular way. Out goes the old thinking, now it's us, right? But the us that you're talking about have already been here for 5 years. Where are your results? If you're saying that our thinking is outdated, remember also that these were people who blazed a trail for many of us to walk. Yeah? So just on the final note on colonialism, here's the thing for me, it's like many of you, when I mention these names to you, you won't recognize them, you don't know them, you may follow them on social media, but you don't know their agenda, you don't know how they've come to be and what they've done to take space in the movement. And yet many of you know the Arcus Foundation website from page 1 to page 90. The same with the ITF website. And that's not a bad thing, right? But it's also good to know that there are people whose shoulders that you are standing on. And some of those people have very, very deep scars from the movement. So when you disrespect the ancestors that you are talking about so casually, Please recite them in your ancestral whispers. When you partner, thank the ancestors that there were people who learned the hard lessons with all of us in the times when we used contraceptive tablets as hormones. When we used any artifact to create beggars for trans men. Understand that the work done by the pioneers was and continue to create a labor of love. Storytelling and oral histories remain a cornerstone of African tradition. Many of the hard lessons I can whisper from my heart to yours, and together we can achieve the impossible. The issues that are outlined here today are African issues, and we have a responsibility to contextualize these to an African understanding, and then we can propose and implement African solutions. With those few words, colleagues, I wish you a wonderful rest of the conference. I think many of you, like me, are flying out tomorrow morning. Party responsibly. Remember to give honor to your ancestors.